everybody, and welcome to week 55 of our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We took an 8-week hiatus for the summer, had a really good opportunity to worship and fellowship with our friends from Sunrise here at the building. That was, I think, a great way to spend the summer. But now somebody's honking on their horn. Now we're back for this format for a little bit, and we're at least going to finish up the Gospel of Matthew, which we started over a year ago. But it's okay because Matthew is longer than the Gospel of John, and my dad once took 18 months to work through the Gospel of John on a Sunday night series, so I'm outpacing him, and therefore I'm winning. We are inching close to the Gospel of Matthew, just a couple of weeks worth of recorded video here, where we left off last time. And if you want to go back, it's week 54 that you can watch. Pilate was washing his hands of the whole situation with Jesus' crucifixion. And we dropped off in verse 50 with Jesus kind of on the cross in his final moments. And that's where we are going to pick up tonight. We are going to do what we did last time, where I give you the verses to look at for the evening, and you pause the video, read through those verses, and then I'll just talk through a little bit to try and help bring some depth and understanding to the passages. There are a few things that I want to do before that, just by way of reminder. Because one of the things that I think is important to the study of Scripture is context. And if you now haven't heard me talk about this in nearly 10 weeks, then we've lost a little bit of the context. So Matthew is a gospel written to a predominantly Jewish community. It is written at a time when there is a significant amount of conflict between the Jewish believers in Jesus and the traditional Jewish synagogue. There is no division as far as these are Christians and these are Jews. They are very much one in the same. And Matthew writes as a Jewish person in the first century about a Jewish Jesus who worked and lived and, functioned in a Jewish community that had a particular understanding about all of that provides background to this. And of course, Matthew then is writing to a Jewish church that's watching this influx of Gentiles and wondering what that means for them, for the church moving forward, for, kind of all of that. And so Matthew is trying to help them understand that the community that God is building in the church is part of God's ongoing work on behalf of humanity, first to the Jewish community, starting all the way back with the patriarchs, all the way through now, and that there's this grafting in of Gentiles, and that the nature of that community, though it looks different on the outside, is still very much the salvific work of God. And maybe that's a good transition point as we talk about the crucifixion and resurrection. Verse 51 of Matthew chapter 27 is where I want you to begin, and I want you to read through the end of chapter 27, so 65. Just, 51 through 65 is all we need for tonight. So go ahead and hit pause on the video. Go ahead and read chapter 57, verses 51 through 60. What did I say? 65, 66, 67, 65, 66. Ooh, there's another verse in there that I nearly left off. So 51 through 66 of chapter 27. And then we will come back, and then you can unpause the video and continue. So pause the video and read. Now you've unpaused the video or skipped the whole pausing process. Still encourage you to read for yourself, but I can't make you. And I'm not going to sit here and read it to you. Instead, I'm just going to talk kind of as we go through verses about what we see here. What we have at the end of 50 and the beginning of 51 is the death of Jesus. Jesus cries out, releases his spirit. Verse 51 is in the moments immediately after that, we have this note that the curtain of the temple was torn top to bottom, that the earth shook, that rocks split, that tombs opened. Although Matthew notes that they leave the cemetery after the resurrection, which maybe that means we're hanging out for 3 days. Matthew is the only one who mentions the whole like resurrection of saints of the past thing. And I got to be honest, he doesn't provide a lot of description, and I'm not really sure what he's trying to do, other than it does effectively communicate that the God of the past and the God of the present are the same God. This is a continuation in what God has been doing. And he does in verse 53 kind of point out that this, is later that takes place. But the curtain of the temple tearing is a big deal, and people don't necessarily know what to make of it. There are a number of different ways to understand that event, and I think the two options that make the most sense, and maybe the answer is both, is that in that moment, the curtain that we likely think they're talking about is the one that separates the Holy of Holies, the place that God resides, the place that the presence of God is, that only the high priest can go into, and only on certain days. And maybe what we see in the tearing of that curtain is that Matthew is making sure his readers understand that now access to God, that is available to everyone. That there's the barrier between God and people is gone. The other thing that Matthew could be doing, especially since Matthew writes after the temple is destroyed in the year 70, is that tying into Jesus' claim that the temple would be destroyed and raised again in 3 days, not only is Jesus referencing his body, but he's also beginning himself the destruction of the temple. Again, Matthew doesn't spell out this is why this matters. We're left to do our best to interpret and make some guesses. I think there's value in both of those, and maybe the answer is both of them. The other thing that's repeatedly noted as you go through this is that the ones who are on the inside, the 12, those closest to Jesus, don't get it and aren't present, right? They've fled. They are MIA at this point. Instead, the people who get it are either dead, right? Popped out of the cemetery and are testifying. Are Roman officers and soldiers who go, that was a son of God. Most translations say the Son of God, but that's not what they say. That's not necessarily their framework for understanding the world. Surely this was a son of the gods. So surely this was a son of God. And women. So dead people, Gentiles, and women. Those are the ones who are in this moment testifying to the power and majesty of Jesus. And it's the women who are consistently there playing witness to what's going on. It's Roman officers who make Roman soldiers who make this declaration about the nature of Jesus, and of course among the women you get the mother of some of the mothers of some of the disciples, but none of the disciples themselves, because they're gone. And again, I think Matthew, who does this a number of times along the way, is highlighting the ways in which it's easy for those who are close, those who are in the middle of something, to miss what's going on, whether that's for the disciples or whether that's for the Pharisees, whether that's for the scribes, Sadducees, religious leaders, or the people in the synagogue who have been going to the synagogue the same way at the same time their entire lives. For whatever reason, it can be incredibly easy for those who should get it to not. And it's a mistake for us to think, therefore, that nobody gets it. Instead, we need to pay attention to the ones who do, even if it comes from incredibly unexpected places, like Gentile soldiers or in New Testament, women. Now, to 21st century ears, that feels odd. I think what's the right way to say this? I've seen incredibly powerful faith in women at times that I haven't seen it in men. And I think about the churches that I grew up in and have served along the way, and a lot of the spiritual leaders of those churches, the rocks, have been women. So it does feel odd for the women to be on the outside looking in here. But that's kind of what Matthew is reminding us of. And that it's important to pay attention to the message, not necessarily the messenger. And that is another valid and valuable point to take away from Matthew's first audience of Jewish Christians who are now seeing these Gentiles who are playing more and more prominent roles in the church and wondering what this means for them, for their traditions, for their customs, for their history, for their lives. And yeah, so and then the other thing that Matthew has to deal with, um, and does deal with in these verses, is the in the immediate aftermath of the resurrection of Jesus, the rumor that gets started, and Matthew places it squarely on the shoulders of the priests and Pharisees and Pilate, is that they'll come up with a way to explain away the resurrection. And the way the resurrection gets explained away, the absence of Jesus' body from the tomb, is, well, the disciples just took his body and tossed it somewhere. They got rid of him. And then they're saying, oh, he raised just like he promised he would. Now, what makes this very funny to me is that one of the things that the Pharisees, especially, consistently uh, gripe at Jesus about is that he does work on the Sabbath. Um, and what you see here in, what is this, like verse 62, is that the leading priest and Pharisees, on the day after preparation, on the Sabbath day, do work. They go to chat with Pilate. So they're going to carry out some official role. They're doing work on the Sabbath in order to ensure that Jesus stays squarely locked away in his tomb. So in spite of all of their complaints of Jesus working on the Sabbath, here go the Pharisees and some other leading priests and religious leaders to do work on the Sabbath in order to ensure that Jesus' body remains in the tomb. And they make this statement, which is prophetic in some ways, right? This will prevent his disciples from coming and stealing the body and then telling everyone that he was raised from the dead. If that happens, we'll be worse off than we were at first. Essentially, if that happens, then it'll render this whole murdering the guy thing useless, which is, of course, exactly what happens. Pilate, who is not bound by any Sabbath laws, informs them that they need to do the work. You take the guards and secure it as best you can. So they sealed the tomb, posted guards to protect it. That was the accusation by the earliest anti-Jesus movement in the Jewish community against this whole idea of resurrection, was that, well, Jesus wasn't really raised. The disciples just stole his body. It's all this big conspiracy. And perhaps not surprising that the religious leaders who have worked so hard to silence the voice of Jesus, first by attempting to out-teach him and then trying to publicly shame him, and then by killing him, would go to such extremes in order to ensure that the movement dies with him. That was very much what they expected, but they had this fear in the back of their heads that it could become something, and they wanted to ensure that it didn't. We'll deal with the resurrection next week. But for right now, I think taking the time to think about the extent to which people will go in order to maintain a flawed system is worth talking about. Because here's the thing. The Pharisees, who are helping coordinate all of this, they are not happy with the Jewish world as it was in the first century. They don't have as much say in Jerusalem and in the temple. They aren't happy with Roman occupation. They are highly concerned that an ongoing occupation by the Romans continues a risk of the destruction of the temple, something that they are actively trying to prevent. The Sadducees and temple leaders don't love the Pharisees. They're concerned about this countryside movement. They're more concerned with maintaining their place of power and authority over the temple and over temple practice and temple life than they are many, many, many other things, including, living in a manner that reflects the love of God. See what they did to Jesus. And Pilate, who I talked about in the previous video, though it was like 9 or 10 weeks ago, his biggest concern during this time period is just preventing a riot. That is his entire job during these religious festivals. He's there to prevent an uprising. And of course, all of them fail. That's what makes this collusion so incredibly interesting, is that ultimately they all fail to accomplish the goals they want to accomplish. An uprising eventually takes place, both literally and also spiritually. The Pharisees and do not prevent the destruction of the temple. The scribes, Sadducees, temple leaders cease to have functional jobs after the destruction of the temple. These are all voices who, by the time Matthew writes, do not matter at all. Um, the Pharisees as a group basically no longer exist. Um, by the time we get to this point, they become the rabbinic schools, but even that is functionally different than what the Pharisees were at this time. The scribes do not scribes. The Sadducees as a movement do not exist. With no temple, they have no place. All at the same time, the church continues to grow and make inroads. The temple has been torn, that access is there, and people are discovering that what God is doing is bigger than what they could have imagined. And maybe that's a good kind of final note, because none of them, including the disciples who fled and bailed, can see what God is doing. Um, what they seem to see is their greatest fears. And all the while, there are people on the outside looking in who are piecing together that what is happening is, in fact, of God. Like there's something. They can't explain it, they don't know it, but they see something. And they manage to hold on to some measure of hope, of faith, to see what God is going to do in spite of what is in front of them. All right. Next week, chapter 28. And I think we will be able to knock out all of 28 in one video and finish up Matthew's gospel. I'm not sure what will come next after that, but I am at least committed to finishing this up at this point. If you have not done so already, even though you've now had, including a couple of breaks, like a year and 3 months to do this, read through Matthew's gospel, beginning to end. And see all of the ways in which Matthew ties these various parables and stories and moments together to produce this overarching message of God's continued work in the kingdom, and especially in unexpected places and in unexpected ways. And we will be back next week to wrap that up. Y'all have a good one.